crossing borders and cultures from past to present.
Hello, what comes to your mind when I tell you that I'm 23 years old, about to receive a college degree within the coming weeks, have a clean record, and I'm in the process with my future career? It sounds like I have somewhat my life together, right? I hope so. I'm planning on continuing to make my parents, my Salvadorian family, or anyone that believed in me proud. But coming here to the United States, boy, did I experience a lot.
Wait, coming to the United States, you're Salvadorian and not a criminal?
Why, yes. I was actually born in El Salvador in 1995 and came to the United States legally since people apparently always ask me what's my status. But thankfully, because of my father, who was already a U.S. citizen thanks to the amnesty of President Reagan back in 1986.
What's the amnesty of President Reagan?
Well, here's a quick history lesson, and I quote Curtis Meese. It was an Immigration Reform and Control Act that was passed and signed into law on November 6, 1986. In short, the purpose of this legislation was to amend and revise the status of unauthorized immigrants. Applicants had to meet a set of prerequisites, possess a clean record, have knowledge on U.S. history, government, and be fluent in the English language, just to name a few. But when signed, the law then awarded green cards to about 2.7 million immigrants. But back to my story. My dad was actually fortunate enough to be part of the millions that managed to get a green card. As time passed, he got a job and was bilingual, fluent in English and Spanish. Eventually, he met my mother here in Los Angeles, who was an illegal immigrant from El Salvador. Long story short, my father decided to marry my mother, help her get her papers to become a resident of the United States, and in time, my mother flew back to El Salvador and gave birth to me there. Why? I don't know. What my father tells me is because he wanted to make sure he gave me another option in case I ever wanted to go, for any reason, back to El Salvador and there wouldn't be any issues since I'd already be a citizen in my homeland. I asked my dad, why did you leave and decide to come to the United States? He says he left because, and I quote, in El Salvador and Guatemala, a civil war broke out back in the early 1980s. Salvadorian soldiers were killing civilians, causing chaos. The United States saw these civil wars break and decided to intervene. After this, a lot of immigrant refugees from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico came onto the United States soil seeking refuge, my father being one of them. When situating themselves in Los Angeles, a gang began to form in los barrios of Los Angeles. During the 1980s, they made themselves known. As BBC News states, they were formed by immigrants who had fled. MS-13 established a reputation for extreme violence. The MS stands for Mara Salvatrucha, said to be a combination of Mara, meaning gang, Salva for Salvador, and Trucha, which translates roughly into street smarts. The 13 represents the position of the M in the alphabet. Skip forward to my young self. Growing up, it was tough here, moving from city to city, from Hawthorne to Inglewood, South Central, LA, and finally where I currently reside, Compton. And yes, most of these cities are famously known as ghettos, or areas with gang violence. Being Salvadorian or just brown skin in general was tough sometimes in these barrios because some people would associate you to violence based on what you wore, drove, to even how you spoke, as my dad always cautioned my family to be careful with these things. It's sad and annoying really, and I thought it would never end. Fast forward to 2016. It's worse. Now America views some of you differently, and I quote Darrell Lind, MS-13 has become the face of the Trump administration's favorite trope. The idea that people from other countries are sneaking into America and importing violence and crime, talking about how MS-13 has allowed Trump to associate crime with immigration without having to deal with the inconvenient truth. Some would go so far to argue that Trump is nonetheless using MS-13 to demonize all immigrants. Some of Donald Trump's president quotes that have stuck around to the present day are, and I quote, "They are not our friend, believe me. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists," referring to immigrants via Twitter. All of his rhetoric actually made a lot of his followers change how they view Mexican, Hispanic, Latino cultures, fitting us all under the same idea of immigration. Some people's views have been influenced by recent events and president's tweets, which have caused intercultural conflict to exist. By using the intercultural praxis found in Sorrell's book of Intercultural Communication, 2nd edition, I was able to understand and break down intercultural conflict. By focusing on framing, I examined my life narrative from micro, macro, and meso frame. These frames allowed me to address and understand some prejudices, racism, history, and identities from an individual, group, and media perspective. What I want everyone to know is that I am an individual who's trying to break these stereotype chains towards Mexican, Hispanic, Latinos to better understand not only my culture and people, but to educate and better any other culture that tries to place themselves on the top of a pyramid, that tries to forget, erase, or repeat history. Thank you.